Tracker essentially is a sequencer which sends notes to either a synthesizer or a sampler, which in a particular tracker I've got, which is called Renoise, you have a collection of samples, as you would do in any sampler, hardware, software, just you know, a tiny little snippet of audio. And the tracker part of it is the grid-based sequencer that works with numbers rather than like a graphical cube. So yeah, this is Renoise. It can run on modern day operating systems. It's got, you know, VST plugins. It'll do everything that any modern day DAW would do. Doesn't get very many updates, but it's rock solid actually. I don't think it's ever crashed on me on its own. The first stuff I put out that I'd made with Renoise was in 2015. But actually, one of the first pieces of software I used was Impulse Tracker. And then other things were a lot more accessible. So like FL Studio, which was Fruit Loops at the time. I used that for quite a while, then Ableton for a while. And then when I started wanting to do stuff with breakbeats and chopped up and just more intricate rhythms, it made sense to go back to a tracker. Yeah, so like 2015, I think I've pretty much exclusively been using this. Instead of going left to right, you're going top to bottom. That's the main difference, but essentially it's the same thing. So if you use Ableton as a comparison, you've got your sampler in here as you would do in Ableton. You've got a mixer. That looks pretty similar, to be fair, because they're always this way up. And you've got, this is where it gets a bit different. Instead of having a piano roll, you have these grids of notes, and they are put in as letters, numbers on the grid rather than little cubes. But other than that, it's pretty similar. And then on the left here, you have what in Ableton I suppose would be your session view, where you've got little clips and you can move clips around, mix and match them, mute them, loop them round, and then sort of sequence your song in this area here. But other than that, they're essentially the same bit of software. They're just a different way of looking at it. I like the tracker in that you sort of get a big overview of everything within the song. If I close this, I could see, depending on how big my screen is, I could see the whole pattern on one page. So you're not diving in and out of different clips, different like little MIDI clips. Everything's there on one page and you can kind of see how everything relates, and it's just quite quick. With key commands to navigate about, I can just dive throughout the whole song, really speedy. So it's just a nice fluid way of getting stuff written down. And it ties in with a computer keyboard as well, as you can hear. So it's just quite a hands-on way of working. It almost feels like using a piece of hardware with the interface as a keyboard. So if you write music on a laptop, it seems quite a logical way to do it to me. This is the project for Fives. So I wrote that in 2021. So this tune, I believe I started with the intro, which is rare for me. I'll usually work on the meat of the track and then kind of build an intro from around there. But I believe this tune, I came up with the idea for the intro before anything else. And then it was a case of following that or getting other ideas to fit in with it. But the basis of it, if I play this, was this sound really, this. The kind of ringing breakbeat, which is, at its source, is a breakbeat. If I get it loaded up, it's cold sweat breakbeat. It's pitched up. I've taken it into each individual drum hit in the drum loop, and they're quite tightly enveloped. So meaning I've just shaped the volume of it so it's a very short sound. It's very pitched up there. But what I've done from there is run it through a delay. The delay time is so short, it starts to become a ringing note rather than just an echo. In fact, I've used a flanger there, it's not a delay. But as you can hear, it works the same as an echo. The longer you spend with sort of software and like audio processors, you realise a lot of it's different names for similar processes, or you're doing similar things to sound in different ways, and that you get a different output from it. So a flanger can sound like an echo if you set it up that way. And then if I turn the delay time up, you get this ringing note. And then what you can do from there is change the pitch of what's going into it. And you get different sort of tonalities from it. It's almost like you've created an object or a drum skin, and you're using different instruments to hit it with. So the drum sample itself almost becomes the drum stick, and the delay then sort of becomes the drum. Or as I go further into the tune, if we move down into the next section, it almost becomes like a sort of guitar sound. And what I'm doing there is I'm changing, and we can see the delay time here, changing the delay time to create a different note. And I can write any melody I want by programming in the delay time. But then you've got quite a rich sort of like tonal source from it with the drum beat. So each little drum beat hits and resonates in a slightly different way. So you get a kind of, it's quite an organic sound. Sounds like a string instrument being played, or a strange percussion instrument being played. And that was the start of the tune. It's layered up here with some sort of hits for, I think that was from a Triton. That was used loads in like sort of early, I only use the Triton sound in there. That was used loads in early sort of early noughties hip hop and R&B. And then I believe, yeah, I've layered up a string set there. That's also from a Triton, which is quite old bit of kit now, but there's a really upfront sound to like old romplers and old sort of workstations that they don't sound very realistic necessarily, but they kind of cut through, and there's an immediacy to them that I like more than if you had a very up-to-date orchestral symphonic sample library. They might have more nuance and depth, but in a dance record context, they don't necessarily cut through that well. So yeah, I do quite like older sample sets for that sort of job. So once I've written this intro melody, I've kind of had a few elements that I could work with then, but obviously you're missing any drums and bass. So I think what I usually do in a situation like this is I'll write a drum pattern and a bass pattern, and then I'll have to try and fit it with another idea. So I'll kind of like squeeze two ideas together. I've got quite a messy working process where I'll just jam out loads of ideas without too much thinking of how it's all going to work, and then try and piece it together later. I just find I get more interesting results like that, because you get a bit of serendipity and things happen. If you don't plan things, you can surprise yourself. That's usually more fun. So I think with this, yeah, I would have had the drum beat. I would have just brought in usually I start off with a breakbeat, and I'll just run it straight. So with this track, it's a think break, and I've got it there in its straight form. That has been processed a little bit. I can hear a bit of time stretching on there. I think I've gated it. I've probably EQ'd it a little bit. And I do tend to do that quite a lot on my drums. I'll process them before putting them into the sampler, just because it keeps it tidier. And then if you do processing later on and manipulate the break, it's sounding good before you put it into those further processes. So I try and do as much as I can before going into the sampler. And then what I'll do is chop up the break into various different chunks, take hits that I want. Sometimes I'll take whole sections, loop them. That's part reverse, so that's a hit there, and then I'll reverse that part of it. So this has been reversed and time stretched, which means chopping the sound up into lots of tiny, tiny little slices and then stretching those slices out. If you change the grain size, which would be the sort of the size of these little chunks here, you'll get different tones. So like a smaller grain size will give you a higher metallic ring to it. And you can be quite creative with that. Here I've just done a straight time stretch with various different hits. This I've used a different algorithm, the algorithm that's built in to Renoise, just to get a slightly different tone, sort of slushier rather than metallic. So yeah, that will tend to be my process for a drum beat. I will chop it up into loads of different tonal parts, and then you've got a kit to play with, and I'll usually just jam something out, as you can hear. So with this drum beat, it's like a 2-3-3 pattern. So we've got 2 beats of kick and then 3 beats of snare and then 3 beats of snare again. So if I loop that quickly. That is the basic like rhythmic foundation of the whole piece. So it's like kick, snare, snare, kick, snare, snare. And then you've got a little filler in between the snares, and that serves as foundation. And then the rest of the drums will follow on from there. I tend to work in patterns of, what is that? That is 2 bars, isn't it? That's 4 bars. So I'll write patterns of 4 bars, and then you tend to put more of a flourish on the end of a bar, like a bit more rhythmic variation. And then once you've got a drum beat, I'll get into a bass, which in this case, it's pretty basic. So that is just essentially a sine wave, which is this, describes this shape here. Like a smooth, about as close to a wave as you're going to get. And I think that's taken from an 808, which might sound slightly different to like a pure mathematical sine wave, but it's basically a sine wave. It could have been a sine wave. And I've run it into a wave shaper. Basically what a wave shaper does is a form of clipping, which means what you're doing is sort of redrawing the shape of the waveform. So straight clipping, hard clipping, you would just cut the top of this waveform off. So it's a flat line, which I can actually do here. There we go. And that sounds like that. If I wave shape it, it doesn't just go into a flat line. It follows a certain set of rules that is defined by what you've drawn in here. And in this case, I think basically what it's doing is it's folding back in on itself. So when the waveform hits a limit, it folds back so that it sort of, I don't know, doubles up. It sounds a bit similar to FM modulation. And then I've also got a flanger and a reverb just for a bit of extra colour on it. But that's the result. You could get a similar result with an FM, two operators of FM synthesis, or you could probably just filter a square wave. But in fact, you can see on this oscilloscope here, so you've started off with a sine wave, and you've ended up with a much more complicated waveform. But there's still a load of bass in it. You can see it's still got a nice round shape to it, which means there's a nice strong fundamental there, but then you've got these little wiggles. They just give it a bit more character. And then, because the volume isn't consistent, you get this movement. And the tone, as the volume increases, the tone changes. And you get this warp sound. Like I said, there's a few different ways to do it, but that is how I did it on the day. And then I just banged in a 2-note bass line. Which has a sort of call and response with the Triton strings. I find that's the key to kind of making interesting patterns. Usually is some sort of intersection between the different elements. So when one drops out, another might fill in the space and there'll be sort of interplay between them. That's quite a good example of it there. Usually the development just goes in sort of blocks of 4 really. So you develop a pattern, maybe do a little bit of call and response within the pattern, and then some sort of variation. Variations usually happen around transitions. If you try and squeeze everything into the middle of a phrase, you can things get a bit buried. But if you kind of focus the dynamics around transitions of ideas and into like the musical sections, the musical structure, you can create movement without crowding out your track. And then we go around a second time and I've brought in a vocal part here, which has been very heavily time stretched. I believe I used something called CDP to do this, which again is built into Renoise, but if you want an equivalent of it, there's something called pull stretch that does a very similar thing. If you want things to be stretched out into insanely long, sort of ethereal walls of sound, that's a tool to do that with. It's a great way of getting pads out of pretty much anything. And that's what I've done there. I think most of the movement in this part of it is coming from the breaks. I've made the rhythm more detailed. I've used more of the processed hits rather than the straight drum hits, just to sort of develop the pattern a little bit. Bassline's pretty much the same. And I'm bringing in the initial break that I used with the sort of delay synthesis, just to add a bit of like peppered flavour throughout it. And then into a breakdown, which the strings take over. And then there's another vocal sample. I tend to just use vowels and just chops of sound rather than full vocals more recently. I don't know, something in just taking something out of context and sort of making it vaguely human, but then not really human at the same time. It's quite interesting, as opposed to just slapping a full verse on a tune. So there's a bit of that. Some sort of like sequencing so as to loop something. So I've just repeated a stab of something to give it a sort of, I don't know, robotic loop sound to it. And then back into the string element. And then a second drop out of a breakdown, and that's, again, similar sort of structure. Similar structure, the bass line has changed up, this new vocal element's been added in, and again, most of the movement is coming from the breaks being chopped. And I'm also using the delay synth to just accent certain snare notes. I think I remember at the time when I was writing it, I was trying to run everything at the same time. So there was like a whole synth line running and the drums running at the same time. I could never get it to work. It's too much. So I find if you just take a little something, it's usually enough to suggest the ideas that you had earlier on in the tune, and stop something from just becoming just a flat drum and bass loop, which always works, but it's always nice to add something. But then I never like adding too much, so it's finding that balance point. And then there's a bit of variation in the bass line there. It's the same bass sound, just adding some extra notes in. I've added like a just playing with a sort of chromaticism there a little bit. So going out of the key, just making adding a couple of wonky bass notes in there. So this section's a little bit different. So here the bass is swapped out for a much more cleaner, it's essentially a pure sine wave at this point. That gives a little bit more space, and then I filled that in with a little tail. There was a tail of the vocal sample, and I've added some echo, or like delay, just to fill the space that I've opened up with by taking the bass line and the strings out. And like I said, with the extra room, I've given myself a little bit more space, so I'm able to fit a little bit more of the melodic element that I was talking about in at this point. And that builds to just purely melodic elements for the outro here. I quite like this sound, which is just it's a drum that I've processed. I think I've probably time stretched it and then put it through a completely wet reverb, which means that it's all reverberated signal, there's none of the original signal in there, and then looped it and enveloped it. And then it becomes a melodic element in and of itself. That's something I like doing a lot. It's like turning drums into melodic elements. I haven't used this method very much, just sort of like a reverberated method, but I think it works. And that brings us through to the end of the tune. That's the tune. That's the tune.